In business and in sports and in politics, there is a pervasive language of war and of conflict. We talk of market penetration, of invading new markets. We outflank our opponents. We get ambushed in office meetings. We form alliances and we engage in battle against alliances. We conduct hasty retreats when facing a superior foe. We arrange a truce or we make peace with our rivals. Perhaps it's only natural that we should speak this way. There is a reason. Ours is a world of conflict and cooperation, and sometimes the cooperation seems only a prelude to conflict. Rather than simply adopting the machismo of war words, we can go beyond the surface similarities. We can study and learn something about strategy from the actual techniques of martial combat. Here, we look at some of the tactical techniques utilized by the military and codified in military manuals worldwide. Successful strategic implementation means following through with crisp execution. It means knitting together your tactical engagements in the service of your master plan. Let's revisit a terminology issue right at the start, the difference between strategy and tactics. The difference between strategy and tactics has always seemed slippery to many people. Sometimes the terms seem to be used interchangeably. There's a very good reason for this confusion. In simplest terms, a strategy is the overall plan, while tactics are the actions you take to execute the plan. Now, this distinction has a long tradition in strategic planning that goes back to the military. This leads to an unfortunate conclusion that strategy refers to the big things and tactics to the details. But as we embark upon our strategic journey into a future that is unsure, there is no way for us to know in advance which details are insignificant and which may loom large as an important strategic milestone for us. Our intended strategy merges imperceptibly into our emergent strategy through the process of strong and crisp execution in responses to what our competitors do. Perspective also plays a major role. Strategic theorist Richard Rumelt put it this way: one person's strategy is another's tactics. That is, what is strategic depends on where you sit. For instance, from the overall perspective of corporate strategy, business units are expected to execute tactics. But from the perspective of a single unit within the business, these tactics for the overall company are likely part of the strategy for the business unit. There may be subunits to execute the tactics of that unit's strategy. What from the top level might be regarded as logistics or operations. Now, the important point to remember is this: execution is the neglected child of strategy, and that follow-through in our execution, our tactics, is a more important part of strategy than the publication of our strategy in a handsome binder. So let's call these techniques strategic maneuvers. As we employ them, let's keep our eyes open for opportunities to change directions, to abandon plans that are gone awry, to follow up victories with more victories, and to allow our realized strategy to emerge from the flurry of actions and responses that play out in the real world. Generals use a variety of strategic maneuvers on the battlefield to engage the enemy. Many of these maneuvers have a long history, some thousands of years old, which suggests their conceptual durability as well as the constancy of human nature. Maneuvers effective in the 1st century BC can be just as effective in the 21st century because the challenges at bottom remain the same: dealing with human nature in conflict. Now, these principles of maneuver can be applied at the level of the army with its thousands of armed combatants down to the level of the individual swordsman. Moreover, these maneuvers have their counterparts in other venues, such as business and in sports. In fact, the lines between these separate venues are blurred and are different only in the level of conflict and the degree of violence. The maneuvers can be faster than the speed of conscious thought. Think for a moment of an individual swordsman, today's elegant modern-day sport of fencing using the tip of a foil to touch a midsection, or the saber to touch anywhere on the upper body, or the tip of the épée to touch anywhere on the entire body, are all direct descendants from military training rapier. As a young college fencer, I found that one learns the same attacks and defensive maneuvers utilized by warriors in centuries past, warriors who played for the much higher stakes of life and death. Let's take a closer look now at some of these maneuvers. Fencing is an elegant sport, a sport of strength, endurance, speed, and guile. Now this is a saber. This is a cutting and a thrusting weapon. We want to score touches on our opponent. The target area of our opponent is everything above the waist, the torso, the arms, wrists, and the head. Protection is essential. Our basic attacks are the chest or belly cut, the flank cut, and the head cut straight on or to either cheek. I can also lunge and thrust with the point of the blade. My opponent attempts to parry these attacks. He parries the flank cut. He parries the chest cut. He parries the head cut. Now, I want to deceive my opponent. I want him to develop tendencies so that he exposes himself to my attack. In this case, an attack to the wrist. Flank cut, parried. Chest cut, parried. Flank cut, parried. Chest cut. It was a feint. Cut to the wrist. The same technique for the head cut. Head cut, parried. Head cut, parried. Head cut. It was a feint. Cut to the chest. These are just a few of the deception techniques we can use. Saber fencing, of course, is much more than hand movement. We incorporate mobility. In this case, the lunge. And finally, we conclude our brief demonstration with a running attack called a flesh attack. Now, in all of this, your opponent's responses combine with learned martial principles to create a dynamic and fluid combat situation. It is from this interaction of strategic maneuvering that the final result emerges. Of course, there is no checklist for successful fencing, much less for actual conflict. You may go into your conflict with a checklist, always beginning in the on guard position, but you will surely be left behind when dealing with an experienced opponent. You must be ready to abandon your line of attack to create and pursue other momentary advantages that present themselves and to exploit them with follow-through. Fencing and the speed at which it takes place helps us understand a broader fact about conflict and competition. After the battle or a series of battles, in hindsight, we might identify a strategy pursued that actually did not exist in your prior intent. This is an important point to remember in studying the great battles and great business moves of history. What actually occurred was often not the result of a carefully wrought strategic plan, but the consistent, swift, and flexible application of martial principles at the place and time demanded of the situation. Now, with this fact in mind, let us examine some of these martial principles and strategic maneuvers. Let's first recognize that not every maneuver or attack is appropriate in every situation. It must make sense. It must make sense in the overall plan. It must make sense in the context of the ongoing battle. And it must make sense given what has already occurred in our current capabilities. It must, in short, have strategic fit. An example of the elusiveness of victory in the quest for strategic fit comes from the Vietnam War. Colonel Harry Summers authored a book about the war, a Clausewitzian analysis of U.S. performance. After the war, Colonel Summers was in a delegation dispatched to Hanoi. In the airport, he got into a conversation with a North Vietnamese colonel named Tu, who spoke some English. They spoke of their recent conflict, as warriors might do. Colonel Summers said this, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." Colonel Tu considered his response, and then he replied, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant." Colonel Tu's point was not cavalier. He described how a powerful opponent, the United States, had pursued a strategy of limited war against a weaker combatant, pursuing a strategy of total war. A powerful opponent that had a muddled strategic intent with unclear objectives, battling an enemy with clear intent and objectives, and pursuing tactics designed to exploit weakness. The weapons, the places, and the times may change, but conflict at its most visceral